If there was ever an example of a promising game held back by a sheer lack of polish, then Contrast is it. We're currently going through a lineup of unimpressive next-gen launch titles that run the gamut of your usual genre conventions, but Contrast stands out as the one that looks more like a passion project than the others. It may just be one of the most creative and unique games going around right now, but thanks to a lack of hype and a final release riddled with technical issues, I'm sad to say that it's probably gonna stay buried for a long while. See, review scores are low and there's a lot of the usual negativity floating around the forums, but you know what? Screw the haters. I think Contrast is cool as hell, and I'm here to tell you why. Sometimes, it seems like it would be easier to resurrect the dead than to get gamers to genuinely enjoy a thing while being fully aware of its flaws, but that's gonna be my case here. I don't know what happened with this game. It might have been rushed out to meet the PS4 launch, or it might have just been a genuine lack of experience on the developer's part. After all, this is the studio's first game, even though there is a lot of Ubisoft experience on the team. But I came out of it really enjoying myself, despite a long list of issues. The most flawed games are oftentimes the most interesting, and Contrast is not an exception. What we have here is a story-driven 3D puzzle platformer with the core gimmick being your ability to fold your character into the two-dimensional shadows on the wall. The aesthetic design is running a 1920s Parisian cabaret theme with the kind of cartoony proportions and surreal geometry that reminds me a lot of the old Double Fine games. So it's a visually and mechanically unique game in a unique setting with some voice acting and technical chops that don't really give it the impression of being a cheap $15 downloadable. But it also stands as a great example of how not to do a lot of things, particularly single-player level design. There's just way too much of that artificial hand-holding. Like a lot of games these days, Contrast has you escorting a little girl through the whole game, and the stuff she makes you do to get through these levels just feels pretty stilted. A lot of the objectives and events just feel like a hat grab, and the cutscenes that present them either show you way too much or way too little.
Maybe you could find another way in.
Wait, why do I have to find my way around? Why can't I just follow you? Oh, right, because the door is chained up and I guess I can't fit.
I can't get in! The door's locked! I need your help!
Wait, why'd you go and set off the whole alarm? Oh, right, because it would make hard shadows that I can climb up, of course. On the other side of the extreme, these cutscenes go out of their way to show you way too much. Like how every time you walk into a new area, the camera pans around to show you what's going on, even though you have a fully controllable camera of your own that you can do the exact same thing with by yourself. I ended up walking into a lot of new areas, panning the camera around and taking in the scenery, only to walk into the invisible trigger that would suddenly stop the game and play a little cutscene showing me exactly what I just did. It reminds me a lot of Alan Wake, and how that game would play a little cutscene before every new mob of enemies spawned, which ended up taking away a lot of the atmosphere, tension, and surprise from the levels. That's just way too much hand-holding. It's more frustrating than it is helpful. And when those little cutscenes do happen, the game also has a nasty habit of slapping a new objective on the screen. It does this a lot, and it's funny how such a small HUD element can stutter the pacing of the entire game. It breaks up your progression into small, bite-sized segments that feel artificially compressed because you're making your way through a map that's actually fairly open, without a lot of those hard boundaries like loading screens and tight walls. And speaking of which, even though this map looks like a big open city, it's really not. You get 2 or 3 dense downtown streets per map, and since your movement speed is also unnecessarily fast, it feels pretty cramped. Gracefully running around and sifting in and out of lines of shadow geometry can be really visceral and fun in a Tony Hawk sort of way, but the levels are just too small for you to really get lost in it and indulge in that mechanic. And it's funny that despite being so small and compressed, these levels also feel empty and barren at the same time. There's a distinct lack of music, sound, and visual detail that seems to ride the line between being a deliberate aesthetic choice or just a sheer lack of production values. And in addition to all those design issues are even more tech issues. They really should have held back for a month or two to polish up the movement system, because as it stands now, I clipped through terrain, I got stuck on terrain, or just got stuck on nothing at all. There's some weird logic behind the collision detection that isn't consistent about deciding what fails you out of shadows and what doesn't, and this is made especially obvious during a full-on Limbo-style side-scrolling segment that lasts way longer than it should. But as far as the actual production goes, there's a lot of great voice acting from the supporting characters, particularly from Elias Tufexis, who shows up as the father.
I miss you, baby. I'm never gonna give you another reason to kick me out, I swear.
So that's all well and good, but unfortunately the voice acting for the little girl character falls a whole lot flatter.
Captain on the deck! Avast there, first mate! Anchors away! Let's heave ho! And hoist the mainsail!
This is unfortunate, because for all intents and purposes, she's our main character. We hear her voice a lot more than everyone else's. But I don't want to harp on about the negatives too hard, because like I said, I actually think the game's cool as hell. I'm going to recommend it. It's only $15, and with some discounts I've seen floating around, you might be able to download it for as low as $11.25. So with reviews as mixed as they are, you probably have at least a 50% chance of enjoying it without too much of a cost to yourself. And for whatever my opinion's worth, I really enjoyed it. Let me reiterate, you will have to put up with a lot of issues, but there's a real heart and soul underneath all those embarrassing mistakes. I've played way more polished games that just didn't give me as many smiles or chills as Contrast did. I guess I was kind of expecting a bouncy, lively, Double Fine platformer, but it ended up having a much more surreal and sinister tone of its own. See, the whole gameplay gimmick with the shadow phasing is incorporated into the plot in a really clever way. You're not playing as the main character. That's the little girl. You're actually playing as her imaginary friend. You're a creation of the mind of an unreliable child narrator who gets swept up in this awfully adult world of crime, vice, and sleaze. Maybe that's why you can't see anyone other than the girl herself. Maybe she only understands just a shade of what's actually going on, and that's why you can't see any of the other slimy, troubled characters in this story. You are her coping mechanism so that she can deal with this tearjerker of a plot, and it's all presented in the cartoony proportions and unrealistic heroics of a childhood fantasy. But after seeing your antics with the shadows intersect with the real world and seeing the girl do some weird things herself, you might begin to wonder just how imaginary your whole point of view is. Maybe even the shadows you're seeing of the real world are actually figments of her imagination too. After all, since you're an imaginary friend, pretty much anything could happen. You see the whole city break itself apart and float off into a gray void, and that doesn't make any sense. Since her parents are breaking up, does that mean her world is breaking up too? But then you'd have to ask if the girl sees the same stuff you do. It's clear that the adults don't see you, but just how much of the adults does the girl see? Just how real is anything that we're seeing or doing, and how sharp is the line separating her imagination from her interpretation and from the actual objective reality of the situation, if there even is one. At some point, when you're stepping through these creepily deserted streets, hearing only the warped echoes of the presumably real world on the other side of her head that may or may not exist, these questions are gonna hit you. It's gonna get pretty weird like that. And then the ending goes and throws a wrench into any easy explanation, leaving it open both to interpretation and to sequels. And maybe that's why I liked this game so much. Like Pixar or Miyazaki, it explores complicated, mature topics through a kid-friendly lens. It's not really about the cheerful, naive innocence of childhood so much as it's about the terrifying powerlessness and ignorance of childhood. I want to say that the concept of obscuring this adult story behind the shadowy interpretations of a child's mind is almost brilliant. It provides for a core gameplay feature that builds an interesting world around an interesting character who doesn't actually have to say much herself. It gives every development of the story a creepy interpretive slant, and it gives the writers and designers a lot of room to play with the player's expectations and get creative with the stuff you see and do. Contrast is a game that feels half-finished, but not half-baked. I smiled every time I saw an unassuming stack of items cast a perfect projection of a 2D platformer on the wall. I loved how I could fold into it and run through it and manipulate the shapes of that little level to my heart's content. I loved how I had to look at rooms differently and pay attention to the shadows and lighting rather than its actual architecture. And I loved how much personality they managed to squeeze into these little shadowy silhouettes of characters. The story ends really quickly, but it still managed to give me chills while it was climaxing, and that is why I think this game is cool as hell. So yeah, I recommend this one. It's only 3 hours long, but it's also only $15. It's multi-platform, and you've also got access to it if you have a PS Plus subscription, so it doesn't waste your time or money. But to enjoy it, you gotta be the type of person who can tolerate something imperfect and unpolished. If you can actually step away from the soulless, manufactured overproduction of AAA games and actually enjoy something while also being fully aware of its flaws, I'd really appreciate it if you checked this one out and gave it a fighting chance. I'm gonna be looking forward to what Compulsion comes out with next, but in order to survive in this market, they're really gonna have to step up their QA for next time. As it stands now, the quality of Contrast is below a level that most people are gonna want to tolerate, but I don't think it's an experience that most people should be missing either. Maybe their next game will hit that happy medium between the two. Until then, I can only hope that the sales of this one are gonna be enough to give them that opportunity.